What is writing about? What is it at its core? One famous author, Samuel Delany, says that writing rules are often about what you do not want to do, so writing is more about avoiding unnecessary clutter than what you put on the page itself. Is that a correct or good view of writing? Is there any value in this advice? That is what we are going to be talking about today. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. So the question I am asking today about writing is writing about what you should not do? Is it about avoiding unnecessary clutter, or is there something more to writing that we need to look at and think about when we engage in the act of writing? So right off the bat, I'm just going to say that I actually disagree with this piece of writing advice. I think it's an incorrect perspective, but I think it touches on something important, but I think it misses the core of what writing is. And if you are going to say writing is more about avoiding unnecessary clutter, if it is more about that, that means that is at its core. And I just can't say that it is at its core. All right. So why is this wrong? If this is wrong, why is it wrong? Because I'm disagreeing with somebody. I need to actually have a reason for why I think the way I'm thinking. Well, writing, I guess I could ask a few questions about it. Is it something that comes from nowhere? Is writing something that just happens? It might seem like it comes from nowhere because talking seems to be something that happens in a lot of cases that comes from nowhere. So if writing is related to talking, then writing would be something that could happen in a similar way or a similar manner to talking. I know that writing isn't exactly the same. We all can see that it isn't the exact same thing. It doesn't come across the exact same way. We don't write in the exact same way we talk, but they are linked. They are absolutely linked. That is correct. So if we have this assumption that writing and talking are linked, and there are many instances when we talk, and the talking comes out as if it's coming from nowhere, as if it's springing out of nowhere, then if people who do not have a great amount of intelligence can talk, and if people can talk without thinking, if you will, then I think that there would be a good argument to be made that you just copy what you're saying, you write that down, and then you prune away the extra until you have that core of good writing, right? So if that was the case, if this is how writing works, then I think that this is a good piece of advice, but I actually think this is incorrect. If it's the case that if we're pruning away what we're already saying, then it is correct. But I think that it misunderstands language itself. All right, because I think that when you look at language, we often think that language comes from nowhere, right? We often think, oh, language, what we're saying, it's so intrinsic, it's so intricately connected. I can't even think of the correct word right now. It's so connected to who we are that we do not even have memory outside of language, or if we do, it's very minimal. We have very minimal memories. We have very few memories that are outside of language. So language is so interconnected with us, and the language we're speaking, it almost embodies us in a way, or we embody that language, whatever you want to say, that it's hard to pull it apart. But though we do have a capacity for language when we are born, right? I would say that there's very strong evidence to say that the human brain is wired for language. Though I think it is the case that we do have a capacity for language, we do not have language, right? We do not have a language when we are born. And we obtain that language, I can't remember the exact word that's used. We acquire that language, that's the correct word, from the people around us, from our parents, from our siblings, from our family, from our community. We acquire this language from those people. So it's kind of like they are taking a torch and they are passing it on to us, right? And you might think, well, yeah, we need to learn the language, but after that we can go on and we can run with the language. and then it's going to come out of us in a way that is very natural, and it's as if we just need to prune away the extra pieces, and we'll have good writing if we do that. But I think still doesn't make sense. I think that you actually need to learn how your language sounds. And I think you need to learn, there are certain things we add into language, and I do it as well. When I talk, we use ums and ahs and different things like that. But within language itself, good speaking, right? If you are an orator, you are not just taking things out of the language. You are saying things in a specific way. You are conveying things with specific words. You are finding those words that are that are most pleasing to the people you're talking about. You're finding the words that fit together the best and are most pleasing to the people you are talking about, or talking to, excuse me. And I think writing is very similar. So we're not just taking things away from our speeches when we're saying, we're not just taking things away when we are talking to make our talking better. We are taking some things away, but when we talk, there's a lot behind it. And this is why I think that people misunderstand it. I think people misunderstand language in general because there's this idea that there is no work put toward conveying things in a clear way, right? There's this idea that people do not have a systematic way of thinking that leads to better speaking, that leads to better writing. And I think that you have to be a clearer thinker to be a clearer talker. And you can still have the ums and ahs in what you're saying, but at the same time, you become more effective when you know where your conversation or your speech or your argument is going, if that makes sense. So for example, if I talk to you and I have no basis in logic, right? I have an episode on logic. I have 4 episodes on logic if you want to check it out. I think it's very important to understand to be a good writer. But if I have no basis in logic and I start speaking to someone, if I start arguing about something to someone, I'm going to go wherever I think seems to be the best and not wherever I think where I know is the best, right? So I might make a logical fallacy and I might follow that logical fallacy to another point. But the moment I made a logical fallacy, I went off on a rabbit trail and I'm going further away from that argument. I'm getting further away from the truth. That's probably the most likely thing that's happening. So within your speaking itself, you actually have to learn how to do things, right? You actually have to learn what is at the core of good speaking. And it's not just taking things away. There is a logical core to speaking well. And though that logical core doesn't come out, though we don't speak in pure logic, though we don't speak in P's and Q's and different things like that, at the same time we have a sense to what we're saying, if that makes sense. Everything fits together in a way that makes sense. Everything fits together in a way that is logical, and that is what I'm trying to say, right? So within speaking, we don't just speak, right? Some people do just speak, but those of us who can speak very well don't just speak and cut things out. They speak in a way that makes sense, right? And you can check out another one of my episodes if you haven't yet. I have an episode on how I think story is at the core of our thinking. So those people who can speak well have a logical core and they have a story core that goes through what they're saying. They need to follow those rules, if you want to call them rules. They're not necessarily rules, but you can call them rules. Now, when we think about writing even goes further than this. So good speaking requires that we actually understand this storytelling nature of language and this logical nature of language, and we actually understand the sounds of the language itself. I'm going to actually have an episode about this in a few days or like a week and a half or so. We actually understand the sounds of the language itself. It's important that we know how to do that, because if we understand the sounds of the language, we can understand how the language fits together, and there is a musical quality to speaking. It has a rhythm, it has a sense of movement, and though it's not music, I'm not saying it's music, it is pleasing to people's ears, depending on what you're saying and how you're saying it. So language doesn't come from nowhere, first off. It comes from our parents, it comes from our community, it comes from those around us when we're babies who teach us how to, they don't teach us how to speak, but they interact with us, they talk to us, they use language with us. And then we acquire that language from them. And there are instances of people who did not have that when they are very small children, and they don't really learn the language, all right? So there's a point in time where they need to learn the language. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do it. So people do need to learn the language from somebody else. But so we have that, and we have this logical core, we have the storytelling core. We go even further with writing, because writing takes on these different things, but it takes it on in a way that is cleaner. It takes it on in a way that is more direct. It's more thought out. It's more well thought than speaking, because speaking just springs from us. And at the same time, you do not learn how to write in the same way that you don't learn how to speak unless you're spoken to. You, even more so, you actually have to go out of your way to learn how to write. Right? You don't acquire writing just because you see someone writing. You don't acquire writing from picking up a marker and scribbling it on a piece of paper. Someone actually has to walk you through the steps of, okay, this is the alphabet. This is what is in the alphabet. This is what all these different letters say. This is how you say all these different letters when you write them or when you're speaking them. This is how you form this specific word. This is what this word means. This is how you put together sentences, etc. All right, there's a lot. We go through school for, depending on where you live, you go through school for about, 12 years or something like that to learn how to do this. And some people do not actually gain the ability to write well even after those many years of doing this work. And I think one of the reasons why is because we have this attitude that people are just going to learn how to write well if they write. And instead of actually teaching students that writing well requires understanding the language. Writing well requires understanding more. So you actually have to sit down and work to get to a point where you're good at writing. It doesn't just spring from nowhere. So how does this connect back? So writing is more about avoiding unnecessary clutter. Writing is a positive thing. This is one of the reasons why I also disagree with this. Writing is a positive thing. Writing is something you have to go out of your way to do. If writing is more about avoiding unnecessary clutter, then writing is something that springs from us without any effort, but it is clear to any writer that there is effort behind writing. Now, I'm a person who says that writing isn't a difficult thing in the sense that it's really hard to do, but it is something that you have to take time to do, which might give people frustration, if that makes sense, right? Putting a sentence together is not difficult in and of itself, but after you put together 20,000 sentences, you might get a little threadbare. You might get a little tired, and that's what I'm trying to say when I say that writing I don't think is difficult, but it can be wearying. So you actually have to sit down to write. So actually, if you want to create good writing, you have to have words coming out of you that fit together in a way that are pleasing to other people. I said that this advice is somewhat good, right? So writing rules are often about what not to do. Writing rules are about what you need to cut out of your writing. I would say that this piece of advice applies to the end of writing. This is in the editing portion of writing. So you get your core down, you get that sense of where you're moving, and the big bulk of writing does take place in the first draft, right? Unless you're a person who writes 3 or 4 different drafts, but you don't necessarily have to do that. So some writers will say, hey, you have to write your book 3 or 4 times to actually be a good writer or to get to a good endpoint for your book. You don't necessarily have to do that. If that's what you need to do to get to a good book, do it. But if you can write a book and you're satisfied with where you've gotten to and you need to do some edits, you can do it in 1 or 2 drafts. You do need to do editing almost always, just because you're doing so much work and people make mistakes on the work. But this applies toward the end of the process, where you go through your writing and you take pieces out. You're taking different pieces out that don't fit, that are extraneous. You're taking the that's out of your book. You're taking certain prepositions out of your book. You're taking certain paragraphs, certain chunks of your book out because it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't hang together with the rest of the book. But when you wrote the rest of the book, you were trying to make the whole entire book hang together, and that's why I say this is not. That's why I say taking things away is not the core of your writing. It's rather part of the writing that needs to happen, but it happens after you've created the core of what your piece is going to be. If you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support me, there's really one simple thing you can do. You can go to danielpoppie.com/newsletter and sign up for my newsletter. And when you sign up, you'll actually be able to get access to my publication roadmap. So that's everything I have planned for pretty much every project I have into the next decade. Again, that is danielpoppie.com/newsletter. You can also find the link below.